What's up guys, my name is Fari, and in today's video I'm going to be going through the bottleneck principle, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I am implementing it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. And like always, the main mission of these videos is to build that Killer Chaos OS, or basically our thinking OS, that basically logs the decisions that we're actively taking on a day-to-day basis, and also the framework that we're using in order to solve problems and build this operating system that ultimately governs how we're thinking and also solving problems. And also to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So every system has a point of friction, a bottleneck, and that is ultimately where its limits reaches its maximum output. And I think thinking about this, or basically thinking in terms of understanding how bottlenecks ultimately operate, is ultimately what's been governing how, for me personally, and also inside Killer Chaos OS, how we've been able to move a lot quicker. Because no matter how hard you optimize other parts, the entire system can only move as fast as its slowest component. And that slowest component will ultimately be the bottleneck. And then that ultimately, for me, understanding this, concept has ultimately allowed me to then ask the question of, hey, where are the bottlenecks that we can actively leak out or just flush out in order to understand where we're moving slowest? Because ultimately the point of friction, or where we're moving the slowest, is ultimately something that we need to solve for in that immediate point in time, because as soon as we can solve it, the quicker we can move. And like I've been saying for the past couple of videos, I'm a big believer in terms of just being able to understand that, hey, you move as fast as your slowest component or your point of friction. And then that question then becomes of saying, hey, if we understand all the parts or all the moving parts within our infrastructure, how can we actively be able to solve this problem, thinking through it systematically, and also from first principles, to ask the question of what components ultimately govern this, and why is this even necessary? Because understanding that, hey, this point of friction is a point of friction because it interacts with XYZ, ultimately allows us to then ask, if XYZ is interacting with this point of friction, then how can we actively make sure that that point of friction does not occur again? And most of the time, just this has ultimately come through deletion, and understanding that, hey, most people obsess over polishing what's already efficient instead of addressing what the true constraint basically is. And that is wasted effort to basically say, hey, there are so many people that are focusing on the things that are already efficient and trying to say, hey, this is already working. And that's super easy to think of, in terms of probably you could say linear thinking per se, to say, hey, each and every single day we are seeing what is efficient, and through this efficiency we don't need to address where the constraint is. But remember, like I said in the beginning, you only move as fast as your slowest constraint, which ultimately allowed me to then ask the question of, how can we actively move a lot quicker in terms of our operations so that we can have more speed? Because I think speed in business is ultimately everything, and being able to solve these constraints ultimately allows us to stay ahead of the curve and also be ahead of the game. Because the sooner or quicker you're able to spot these inefficiencies and ultimately flush them out in order to say, hey, this is what is ultimately a constraint within our business, and not only in business but in our personal life as well, saying, hey, you want to get something done. For example, you want to read an hour each and every single day, but the friction is that you're not feeling motivated. So ultimately understanding that you have this friction point, which is motivation, reading an hour each and every single day, ultimately swapping that out and saying, hey, I don't need motivation, I need discipline. And through that discipline, that is going to build the compounding effect that is ultimately going to get me to my overarching goal, which is reading an hour a day. And ultimately understanding that, hey, this skill is identifying a single choke point that holds back the flow. And I think in thinking in terms of flows, of how things flow and interact with each other, ultimately has allowed me to say, hey, We ultimately understand that within our current infrastructure, because we flow, in terms of our client acquisition, our first touch point, all the way to our clients, hand off when we hand off the project, we understand the entire flow. And simply by understanding the entire flow from first principles, then we're ultimately able to say, hey, we can identify the choke point, because this choke point may not always be as apparent, but by asking questions and just asking the, key questions that ultimately allow us to dig a lot deeper, to say, hey, we may think that the choke point is simply, in terms of, we're not making the experience pleasing. Then we ask, why aren't we, making the experience pleasing? What are the components that ultimately govern to this, experience, that ultimately makes it pleasing? And asking those questions of saying, hey, what are we actively doing? Okay, we found out what we're actively doing. Where could we improve on? Okay, we've got that also as well. And we've also got the data points of saying, hey, we're getting feedback as well from our client to say, hey, I wish, when we were onboarded, things were a bit more clear in terms of clarity. And we ultimately build off these data points and understanding that, hey, this is where the, choke point is, or the point of friction. And that ultimately means that, hey, we're ultimately solving this, because whether it's a lead qualification in sales, response time in support, or a task handoff in operations, this also governs how it ultimately runs. And understanding this ultimately helps us, flush out these choke points, and saying, hey, fixing one bottleneck can ultimately unlock 10x more capacity than optimizing everything else combined. And solely understanding this principle that, hey, we can unlock 10x growth simply by focusing on the things that are holding us back, using inversion thinking as well to say, hey, what could possibly go wrong? And by asking or taking this frame of approach, we can then, dig a lot deeper to say, okay, this can go wrong. Why would it go wrong? Does it actually actively need to go wrong? And just, taking a first principles approach in terms of asking questions to say, hey, are we actively, needing this process in terms of our flow? If not, and it's causing a constraint, why don't we just then delete it? Because simply by being able to delete that simple step, we reach that ultimate goal of being more efficient. And solely through that, that's why I, have seen in my personal experience that the lead operators that I've come in contact with don't ask, how do I do more? They rather ask, what is the constraint? Simply by solving, because they understand that by solving the constraint, you're ultimately able to move a lot quicker within your daily operations. And I think this primarily is a framework that ultimately works is specifically in sales. When you're looking at your sales flow, basically asking, hey, this is our current sales flow. What are the constraints within our current onboarding process, or our current outreach process? And then asking the questions of saying, hey, okay, this is what we've gathered as a data point. And through that, we just keep asking why 5 times. And I think this is ultimately something that has been a big proponent of my life, which is ultimately asking why. And I think when you're young, you always ask, why is this like this? Why is that like this? Why can't it be like this? Why can't it be like that? I think ultimately, as you grow up, sometimes you often do lose it, and I did to a certain extent. But ultimately, just understanding that, hey, I'm going to ask why at least 5 times until I get to the core of it, to truly understand the constraint. Because when I truly understand the constraint, I know that ultimately removes that bottleneck, and then ultimately allows us to move a lot quicker. Because like I said, speed is everything in business, and I want to be able to remove the bottleneck, because I want to make sure that the whole system breathes. Because if you remove the bottleneck, the entire system then is able to breathe, and it ultimately functions as an OS, basically an operating system. The way that I like to view things, like I've mentioned in the past few videos, that everything I like to view it as an operating system, and operating systems are governed by certain key functions, and those functions dictate how it's able to run and also make decisions as well. So how can we basically sharpen our thinking OS? I'm a big proponent of this. I know we're going to fail so many times, but also the things that we are going to get right, we're going to make sure that we're just hammering in that, and also making sure that each and every single day we're striving towards that source of truth, towards building our source of truth in more detail and specificity, and making sure that each and every single day we're just hitting the nail in the wall, and ultimately figuring out where the constraints are and building from there. Because each and every single day that we lay in terms of just building out these videos, or just building the thinking OS, is ultimately a brick into the foundation where Killer Chaos OS, our internal operating system, is inspiring millions of people, having $100 million worth of impact, and also just most importantly being able to redefine industries as well. Because I think with those three key goals, we ultimately are gonna hit them in the future. It just ultimately takes these daily actions and making sure that each and every single day we're striving towards that goal, and we're just making sure we understand each and every single moving part. And through that, we're gonna fail so many times, but I know we're gonna be a step a lot. We're gonna be a lot closer if we take these steps today, so that we can build the future tomorrow. So if you guys liked this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.